The climate is changing. Oceans are warming. Extreme weather is more common. Threatened species are under strain. Whether we accept it or not, it's happening. What we might do about it is up to us. We're on borrowed time.
I'm Andrew Murphy of the Mill Valley Public Library, recording on behalf of the Borrowed Time series. Today I'm joined by Bathsheba Demuth, author of Floating Coast, An Environmental History of the Bering Strait. Demuth is an environmental historian at Brown University specializing in the United States and Russia and in the history of energy in past climates. She has lived and studied in Arctic communities across Eurasia and North America. Thanks for joining.
Thank you, Andrew. It's my pleasure.
I know you first moved to Alaska when you were 18 years old, and I'm curious to know what some of your first experiences in Alaska that really changed the way you viewed the world or set you on the trajectory to become a historian of the region.
Sure. And I actually was in the Yukon Territory, which is in Canada, which many Americans conflate with Alaska. It's a pretty common flip. And I lived in a little village about 80 miles north of the Arctic Circle called Old Crow for a couple of years. And my primary job there was to train sled dogs. And I was not thinking at the time about becoming a historian because I was 18. Despite that, however, I think a lot of that experience really shaped the way that I think about history, in large part because so much of my life was spent figuring out how to navigate the landscape, how to sort of think my way through surviving a place that was very different than the one I grew up in, and doing so with sled dogs. So I was constantly thinking about the ways in which animals and other beings that aren't people were really important to my daily life and my survival, because it's so very clear and obvious that your survival depends on sled dogs in a situation like that.
How, just out of curiosity, how far out did you leave the town on the dogs?
I think the farthest I ever ran was about 100 miles out. Sometimes I'd run out and camp somewhere. In the spring, in particular, people have camps north of Old Crow in this region called Crow Flats, where they're muskrat trapping. And sometimes I'd take a team out there and then camp at someone's cabin or wall tent, and then run back.
Yeah, I suppose that would make you very aware that your life depends on the dogs. Were there any other experiences that, say, were in relation to some of the book animals you feature in your book, like caribou or whales that you encountered at that age that just, say, were culture shock to you?
I think another thing that really was formative, and particularly because I was so young when I went there, was the way in which my host family, who were Gwich'in, so it was a majority native village, understood the animals that they lived around and survived because of, it was really different than the way in which I saw people hunt where I grew up in Iowa, which was much more kind of a hobby, something you did on the weekends, and sometimes was done, frankly, just for trophy purposes. And the way that people hunted in Old Crow and understood their relationship with animals was much more kind of intimate and intertwined, and one in which caribou in particular were understood as, not just animals, but really constitutive parts of social life. And that was a new way of thinking to me, and one that wasn't even spelled out explicitly. It's not like anyone sat me down and said, this is how we here understand caribou, and it's different than how you grew up understanding animals. It was much more kind of a gradual process of realizing that that's how people comported themselves and talked about these animals and understood the wider social world around them.
I don't normally ask writers questions about process, but I am curious at what point in your research did you decide to frame this history through the lens of a lifespan of a bowhead whale?
Yeah, that's a good question. When did that happen? I think it happened quite early partly because the whale chapters come first, and when I sat down to write those portions, I had just come off of 2 years of doing the primary source research, so traveling in Russia and the United States, and was reading a lot about whales and realized that some of these whales kind of outlived the history that I was planning on telling, and that made them a very kind of a crystallized way of making some of the arguments of the book about how time operates different for different kinds of animals, and that humans sort of intersect with those time patterns. Because here is this animal that has been alive almost as long as the United States has existed, or as long as the United States has existed when it died, and outlived the Soviet Union by quite a bit. So it's kind of a lifespan that's even longer than some political projects have been. And then that allowed me to kind of enter into the story through the perspective, as much as I can tell it, of a whale, rather than centering it around people from the very beginning.
I also had a question about bowhead whales and the concept of them offering themselves to the hunter. I know some people kind of have a problem wrapping their head around that, and I'm just wondering if you've identified the best way to kind of describe this concept in an effective way that either helps people better understand and appreciate that, or even believe it.
Yeah, I think it's a difficult concept for people who don't have a lot of familiarity with thinking about themselves as a part of an ecosystem, to use kind of a Western term for it. And in particular, to think of themselves as parts of ecosystems where they don't have the capacity to be the kind of most powerful being within it, right? That a lot of audiences that I talk to about this concept are very used to an idea of human uniqueness and human supremacy, which makes a lot of sense if you're living in a temperate zone and living a very kind of technologically encased life in a space like that, is to imagine that, you know, human beings have a very particular and kind of outsized capacity to influence the world around them. But that's not really how life feels when you're in the Arctic, and particularly when you're in the Arctic without that kind of technological buffer between yourself and the world. It's much clearer that the dependence runs in both directions, right? If whales don't come near enough for you to hunt them, you're not going to make it through the winter. And so this idea of the whales giving themselves is a thing that starts from a position of understanding the human place in the world as highly contingent and interdependent on the actions of other animals, rather than on one where humans are the only kind of animal that can make a moral choice or have agency in the picture. And that's, you know, I understand why that's not an easy place for people to get to, because it's not how we're taught to understand the world in most, in most contemporary classrooms, for example. We're kind of taught to think about humans as supreme and unique beings. So I think it requires some working backward out of that mindset and thinking about yourself in a position where you really are genuinely dependent on the behaviors of other kinds of animals and other beings around you in order to survive from season to season. And I also think that it's a way of relating to animals that is particular to that place. I don't think that it's one that can necessarily be exported wholesale to other environments. It's an understanding of the world that comes from a deep-rooted experience of living there that goes back for several thousand years, at least. And so I don't necessarily think that people have to kind of take that on in their daily lives if they're living in California or if they're living in Rhode Island. But I also don't think that judging people who live in the Arctic with the ways of relating to environments that come from California or Rhode Island is particularly appropriate either.
Your book includes a preface on names, and specifically so about the people that live along the Bering Strait. And I'm curious how important it is for people that live in the lower 48 as people that share a country with the people that live along the Alaskan side of the Bering Strait to understand who these people are, including their names.
That's a great question. And I think it's quite important. And I think it's important not just in the context of Alaska, but more generally for people to become more kind of fluent and aware of the indigenous people of the United States, of North America more generally, and also other parts of the world, and the names that they have for themselves and the territories that are theirs historically, and in many cases continue to be the places that they live, and the histories of how they have been dispossessed in some cases. So that preface is in many ways a way of trying to make that argument a little bit at the beginning of the book, that it's incumbent on those of us, even if we're not all that familiar with a particular part of the United States or of Canada or of Russia, to think about it as a place that has this really long history of habitation and a place that we can become familiar and bring those histories in as part of our way of understanding them.
You used the word dispossessed, and oftentimes genocide is used. Do you think that's appropriate word for the Alaska experience?
I think in the case of U.S. government policies, and you can kind of extend this to thinking about Russia as well, that the stated goal of many policies of the U.S. government was to destroy indigenous cultures as cultures, which is one of the things that kind of falls under the definition of genocide, right? It does not require the physical elimination of people. It doesn't require killing everyone. It requires destroying the transmission of cultural identity between generations. So aggressive assimilationist policies, which in some parts of U.S. history have also come with enormous violence, do, I think, fall under that terminology, because the end goal was a kind of assimilation that left no place for indigenous difference and indigenous cultural practices. I also think it's important to note that it was not complete, right? These are actually cultures that have managed to survive those policies, in many cases directly in spite of various things that were being imposed on these communities, but retain a great amount of cultural integrity into the present.
Yeah, and one of my questions was to ask you about the current culture in Beringia today. Is it fair to say the culture today is adapted to Western civilization, but was never, as wiped out?
Yeah, and I think it's important to say that indigenous cultures all across North America have not been wiped out, right, and have managed to find ways of existing kind of in spite of or around the colonial processes that have taken place. And Alaska is a different kind of case in some ways, because U.S. government policies come to Alaska quite late, and in many ways look different than they do in places like California, where they're kind of a direct extension of moving an agricultural, settler, colonial way of living across the U.S. West. And particularly in the part of Alaska that this book is about, there weren't any dreams of making it an agricultural space, so colonization looked quite different for that reason. But it's not to say that the U.S. government wasn't really interested in assimilation and has all sorts of ways of trying to achieve that during the 20th century that these communities have worked with and worked around and worked against over the last 150 years or so. And I think one of the things that is kind of outside of the scope of this book, just because of where the time of it ends, is that Alaska right now is experiencing, I think, a real emphasis on the revitalization of indigenous cultures, and particularly around things like teaching indigenous languages and having them be part of curricula, and other efforts to make sure that cultural transmission is really strong between generations and is built into the ways that people imagine the future.
I guess I'm also curious about how you view, say, the current culture, not so much how you view the current culture, but rather I sensed a sense of almost criticism of other Americans, particularly in the 70s and, say, the hippie era, that, in your words, adored the idea of Native Americans. And I guess I'm just curious if you have an opinion on how people in the lower 48 specifically should view Native Americans. I guess I shouldn't limit it to the lower 48, though.
Right. I mean, that the section of the book where that question comes out of is a section where I'm talking about a certain kind of 1970s environmentalism that often would use indigenous people as kind of mascots for a kind of harmonious, unchanging relationship with nature that had nothing to do with the way that indigenous folks have actually lived in the places they inhabit, and had everything to do with a kind of romanticized understanding of the native past. And so I am really quite skeptical of that. And I think one of the really important things to do as non-native peoples is to understand native societies as dynamic and changing and political and human entities, just like any society, and not kind of fixed in some romantic past where they were unchanging and lived in perfect balance with each other and with nature, which is really just sort of a way of understanding indigenous people in order to critique things that Western societies have done, rather than actually understanding Native people on their own terms or looking at the ways that Native communities understand their own histories and narrate those pasts. So that's really kind of where my critique in that section is coming from. Instead of really engaging with the ways in which Native communities understand the environments that they live in and understand their relationships with animals and ecosystems more generally, there's this tendency to kind of just idealize and not engage with these people as actual people in the world who are making decisions and navigating complicated political presence and thinking about the future in really dynamic terms.
How did the Russian and Soviet influence on indigenous people in the Bering Strait differ from U.S. Influence?
That's a good question. And I think in some ways, from an abstracted view, they actually look quite similar to each other, because both the United States and the Soviet Union had kind of formally assimilationist colonial projects, right? They wanted to move into spaces that they had not had political control of, take political control of them, and make the people who lived there part of mainstream U.S. or Soviet culture. So in that sense, they're doing really different things. In kind of a practical, on-the-ground sense, the United States has a really different relationship with Alaska than the Soviet Union has with its north, partly because the Soviet Union has so much more Arctic and subarctic territory. It's a huge piece of Russia, whereas it's kind of this small and often forgotten part of the United States. And so making Arctic spaces kind of fully participant at all times in the Soviet project is kind of front and foremost in the Soviet designs from very early on, whereas the United States has this kind of ebb and flow relationship with what it's doing in Alaska. Sometimes it's, pouring lots of resources into it and sending lots of missionaries and building lots of schools. And then sometimes it kind of withdraws and doesn't do very much at all. And that means the experience for indigenous peoples in the two places is somewhat different, because in the U.S., there are these kind of pulses of activity. There's resources that come and then disappear again. And the Soviet Union is much more consistent. In some ways, it's consistent not in particularly good ways, right? It can be so kind of formally committed to making everybody part of the Soviet project that it's willing to do it with great violence, in a way that the United States does not use by the time it arrives in Alaska. Like U.S. colonization all the way west into California is extremely violent against indigenous people. And by the time it gets to Alaska, there's much less open warfare. There's very little, in fact. Whereas on the Soviet side, it tends to be much more violent from the very beginning. So in that sense, I think they're different, because the Soviet kind of commitment to making everything within the Soviet Union part of the Soviet project was considerably more intense than the American one, which sort of assumed that, the market will kind of get to Alaska and then the state will follow in many ways.
Your book does a great job of making the distinction between the people doing the work, such as the whalers and the gold miners, from the companies they work for. I'm curious to know what you think of the complicity of the people doing the work, such as whale harpooners.
Yeah, that was the thing when I was writing the sections on whaling, and actually kind of throughout the book really wanted to try to separate blaming people who often had very little agency over their kind of economic endeavors in particular from the structures of power that kind of required particularly exploitative kinds of interaction with environments. And I think the whalers are particularly kind of acute examples of this, because from their logbooks and their diaries, it's very clear that they understood that they were killing whales to a point that might render some species extinct, and they use the word extinct. Some of them are extremely troubled by the ways in which commercial whaling removed so many whales from the ecosystem in the Bering Strait that indigenous populations that depended on whales were in starvation. And in many cases, the whalers feel and kind of write in very emotionally laden language about how difficult it was to kill animals that they understood as being social and sentient and having relationships with each other. But one of those things that happens when you have such a separation between consumption and production is that, the people who are consuming whale oil don't care if it's a miserable job, right? And it's not reflected in the price of the oil at all. And it was something that I wanted to bring out in the book because I think if it's present in whaling, it's become even more acutely present in all sorts of other ways that we live life now. It's certainly present in contemporary meat production, that working in a slaughterhouse is not anyone's first choice of job because it's so incredibly physically and emotionally taxing. And it's a kind of job that ends up being pushed on people who have very few other options, and usually experience quite a bit of other oppression in their lives. And that it's in fact the consumers more than anything that are enabling this rather than the people who are at the kind of point of the knife in some ways. And it's also true of the people who own the businesses. And that was a thing with gold mining and with whaling and some of these other industries that I wanted to bring up because I think it has resonance with the kinds of decision making that happens around fossil fuels. That, it's not necessarily the person working on the Bakken shale fields right now in North Dakota who is directly to blame for our dependence on fossil fuels. It has to do with the kind of political world that supports them, and it has to do with consumer choices that support them. And so kind of blaming the labor in some sense, I think is cutting off a place where we can actually really create solidarity in a place that environmental movements have in fact been quite bad at it in the last 50 years or so, because there might actually be more common ground there than we see.
Right. I'm reminded of Judy Barry. I don't know if you know her story, but she kind of in the late 80s was trying to protect redwoods, and she helped the loggers get unionized as a way to fight the logging companies.
Right. Yeah, that's a great example of this. Yeah.
And I wanted to ask about gold mining in Nome. The section of your book that describes gold mining is such a contrast to how gold mining is romanticized to tourists, or at least in other parts of Alaska, like Skagway, for example. But more than just the way people pan for gold when they get off a cruise ship, but just the idea of Alaskan sourdoughs as tough pioneers is a point of pride to people that view themselves as rugged Alaskans today. And I'm just curious if you've had any feedback from people that live in Alaska where this section surprised them or changed their views on its mining history.
I haven't heard from anybody, although I imagine that that's the case because it is very much, it does very much counter the kind of triumphant vision of mining here. So I'll be curious as I spend a little bit more time in Alaska this month if people have read it and really reject that version or think that I went too far in kind of pushing back against the idea that this was romantic. I think it's not a particularly revolutionary take if you're a historian working in kind of academic history, because the idea that gold rushes are, generally speaking, creators of many people who lose out. They're good for corporations, but not for individuals, and has been established through a whole sequence of rushes, the silver rushes in the American West and in California, and then the Klondike Gold Rush, and then Nome is kind of the final in this series of instances where most of the people who go to them tend to be the losers. And it might be a moment in the United States when skepticism about the kind of capacity for capitalism to really deliver on its promises is high enough that maybe I won't get quite as much critique as I would have, some years ago. But I'm sure there are people who quite disagree with my perspective.
I've never been to Nome, so I don't know if like there's visible scars on the landscape from the mining. Is that like visible? Can people see that, or is it just kind of grown over at this point?
No, it's quite visible. There are still marks on the hillsides, and there's old ruined mining equipment all over the place. So it looks like most former mining boom towns in that sense, that people are living on slag heaps and next to old dredges. And because it's so far north, in fact, some of the growth takes a lot longer to take off. So it's probably more visible than it is in some other places.
It's on the topic of whaling. You had a great quote, "Death made invisible by those who consume it." And I'm just wondering if you mind sharing your thoughts on the separation of the consumer and the product in the context of whales.
Yes, sure. So I think many people who work in environmental history kind of diagnose this issue that only increases in the course of the 19th and 20th century, particularly as fossil fueled enabled shipping becomes more and more common, that the things that people consume in particularly parts of the wealthy United States and the places that they're produced become further and further apart. So that, the state that many of us live in now, where we're able to consume many, many things and have absolutely no idea where they were manufactured or where the raw materials of their manufacture came from, kind of has this longer history. And that whaling is actually kind of an interesting and early case of a supply chain where the distance between producer and consumer becomes so vast that, people along the eastern seaboard of the United States are able to buy whale oil and whale baleen products and have no real connection with either the labor that went into producing them, the really dangerous, pretty extreme work that happened on these kind of Moby Dick style tall ships, or the experience of the animals themselves, and particularly experience of depletion that many whale species were facing in the 19th century. And so it, in some ways, impoverishes or limits the set of choices that consumers have, because if you don't have that knowledge, you're unable to think about having an ethical relationship with the thing that you're consuming. And therefore it's sort of out of sight, out of mind. And it has this sort of paradoxical reaction where it simultaneously frees people from having to think about the world that they live in, and also making goods cheaper at the same time. So it has this real sense that you're kind of disaggregated from the kind of consumption that you do.
Thank you. And I guess along the theme of ethics and morals, the book is a history, and yet there are clear ethics and morals addressed. What is your hope for the biggest takeaway in regards to morals and ethics for the history you address?
I think what I really hope with this book is that if people reading it get a sense that making political decisions or making more moral or ethical judgments that are completely unable of taking into account the world that isn't human really limits our capacity to make good decisions for the world. And it does so in ways that have real repercussions for human societies. I think it contributes to environmental justice issues around the world because partly because of that dynamic of making the sites of production invisible to the people who consume them. We also make the people who bear the brunt of doing that productive work in dangerous places or under dangerous conditions invisible. And that's a justice issue. And then it also cuts us off from being able to have a fuller and kind of more ecologically complex set of relationships with animals and plants and kind of larger systems that sustain us. And I think that one of the things that sort of emerged for me when I was writing this book was a sense that all of the history that we tell as being only a human story, if you look very close, is also a story that's so deeply embedded and enmeshed with all sorts of other life on Earth, and that telling that story in that way just enriches our understanding of who we are as people, of what history is, of what counts as an important event in that history, and in some ways, and how to kind of carry some of those lessons forward into the future in a way that might give us a more dynamic and more complete sense of how it is that we should act in the world.
I don't suppose you'll just share the actual answer for us, right? Like, how should everybody live?
How should everyone live? I mean, if only it was that simple.
I know.
I think one of the things that was striking to me in writing this book is that the way that people live and have lived in a way that seems like it has the capacity to be sustainable, might be the shorthand term for it, that does not erode ecosystems in the really long term, allows people to live rich and full lives, but also leave space for other kinds of beings to have life, is actually really quite dependent on the ecology you live in. So, for example, one of the kind of critiques that runs under the surface of the last couple chapters of the book that talk about the development of modern environmentalism is that it kind of exports a certain way of living to the Arctic that doesn't make any sense there, specifically one where people never hunt whales. And, that makes perfect sense if you're living, where I grew up in Iowa. There's no reason to eat whale there. There might not even be reason to eat very much meat there at all because it's a place that has such a flourishing capacity for plant life and all kinds of plant life. But that's not the same as it is in the Arctic. And so that the kind of tendency that we have coming out of the sort of Western intellectual tradition to make universal rules for everybody in every place, I think is actually, if you look at things from the perspective of what the particular ecosystems are able to do and how they operate, doesn't actually hold. And so some of it, to me, is a question of looking at the place that you live and looking at the kinds of life that are able to flourish in that place and look at the kind of life that's necessary for humans to live well, and then kind of negotiate that relationship based on the place. So it looks really different in Northern California than it does in Alaska, and it looks really different in Alaska than it does in Rhode Island. And we're not actually, I think as a society right now in the United States, very used to making those kinds of decisions explicitly, and that's actually something that we could work toward.
Do you think, and I'm just going to say this in general terms, a major U.S. city, whether it's East Coast, West Coast, or in the middle, is capable of living sustainably with the resources in their region? I mean, I'll just leave it at that instead of answering the question myself.
I mean, that to me is the question that is really the one for my generation, right? Is that we have to figure out a way to sustain our lives in a manner that does not require such an intense use of fossil fuels, and in which we really think about consumption differently, and do so, I think, with the charge that we eliminate some of the inequities that have become so entrenched in the way that we currently distribute kind of goods and wealth in the world. And I don't know. I'm a historian, so the thing that I know best is what's already happened. And my sense from studying history is that when people, get into sort of wild prognostications about the future, they're usually wrong. So I'm a little hesitant to come out one way or the other. But I do think it's really incumbent on us to start thinking about these questions really seriously, and use the kind of ingenuity and capacity for adaptation that I think history does show that people have. And not just adaptation, but the capacity to make really rich, meaningful lives out of all sorts of ways of living. So it doesn't take, advanced industrial capitalism to have a good life. So, thinking about those questions of the kind of equity and justice first and foremost, and then thinking about what that would look like at scale. It's a great question, and I don't have a simple answer to it.
I wasn't expecting one. I was very happy with the answer you gave. And I almost pushed you on the historian thing and asked, what about the cliche, those, who don't learn history are doomed to repeat it? Actually, I will use that, and I'll segue from that cliche to some of the current situations in Alaska in particular. Your book does a great job of showing the value of a walrus to its entire ecosystem and as its own species. So I didn't really want to ask too many questions about what you did cover in your book because I just think you already covered it and it's fantastic. But I am curious to ask about some of the animals you highlight in their current status. I did watch a lecture by you recently, and you noted the bowhead whales are not where they should be. And I guess, well, one, where are they? And do you have any sense of why they might be there?
Yes, so that must have been a lecture I gave last fall where the sea ice off the coast of Alaska and the Beaufort Sea in particular was significantly further north than it usually is by late October and November, so that the bowhead whales were up along the edge of the sea ice rather than being closer to the coast of Alaska. And that mostly has to do with the fact that the sea ice in the last several years in Alaska has been at a much lower extent than normal. So it's it's not coming as far south as it has historically and kind of should. And that means that the bowheads, which tend to live on the edge of the sea ice, are also staying much further north than they would otherwise. And for the bowhead whales, it's a really open question what this change in the sea ice is going to mean for their population. They're actually doing quite well right now. They've recovered from the kind of spree of industrial killing in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Their population has really rebounded, but how they're going to adapt to a really changing sea ice profile, and along with the changes in the sea ice, the fact that shipping is really opening up along the Bering Strait. So both vessels that are going north of Russia, so going between Asia and Europe by going through the Arctic Ocean north of Russia, and potentially vessels that are going north of North America by going north of Canada. So the Northeast and Northwest passages will be open to shipping in the summer quite soon. And that means that there's going to be just way more industrial traffic going through bowhead territory. And generally speaking, that's not great for whale species. It's been really very destructive of Atlantic right whales, for example, which are essentially going extinct in real time due to collisions with vessels in part. How that's going to work for bowheads, we really don't know. So they're in kind of a question mark category. Walruses are in some ways in a similar position where they're a very sea ice dependent species. That's where they hang out in order to have access to the kind of seafloor animals that they feed on, while also being able to haul out of the water and breathe air because they're mammals, and so they need that to be able to rest and to have babies. And so as the sea ice moves around and its relationship to where they need to feed and things like that changes, there are also real questions about what's going to happen to walruses.
Your book also includes significant time towards caribou. And I'm just curious, are you familiar specifically with the Mulchatna caribou herd in southwest Alaska?
Not nearly as much. I know a very, very little bit about them because most of my work is way far north of there. So I'm hardly an expert.
The reason I brought them up in particular, that herd, is I saw in the news that this year, or this hunting season rather, they cut the number of allowed caribou taken in half because the population itself is half of what it was last year. And, there's interviews with fish and game people from Alaska saying they don't know what happened to the population. And in your book, you note that, there's a lot of different variables in how the caribou numbers vary based on availability of lichens or presence of wolves, and that's, excluding human influence. And I'm not there and I'm not a scientist, but I do know that Alaska had a very warm year. There was wildfires, and if it was warm, the lichens didn't presumably do as well. So I'm assuming that the increase in heat affected them, but I was just curious if you knew about that particular herd.
Yeah, I don't know about that herd in particular, and I think it's part of a sort of general trend with caribou and reindeer populations around the Arctic, which is that they are in decline generally. And the question is this part of a kind of more predictable and regular decline because these are populations that can grow and decline pretty rapidly, or is this something that's more tied to climate change? And the particular decline that we're in right now has been happening for a longer period than is normal historically and is much larger. So caribou populations are down globally, by several million animals. And that's likely tied to kind of a series of factors that have to do with slight warming in the climate. But with all of these things, it's really hard to triangulate, specifically. It's kind of like saying one particular hurricane is caused by climate change, because what goes into making a hurricane is this whole complicated set of things, one of which is that having warmer seawater makes it more likely to have hurricanes. And caribou populations are in kind of a similar state, that there's lots of different things. But that's a particular species for which having a warmer Arctic is a much harder place to make a living. They're ice age animals. They like the cold. And there's many things that tend to have negative impacts on herds when it's warmer.
Thank you. And I guess, rather than just focusing on a particular species, I wanted to address some local issues up there, including federal laws that are changing the local issues, like the, say, roadless rule repeal in the Tongass Forest, the weakening of the Endangered Species Act, and the recent repeal of laws that allows hunting from air and including hibernating animals as fair game. I can only assume, if I were just to ask, what do you think about that, I would know the answer. But what do you think we can do to address this sort of lack of learning from our history and beyond just, say, writing a letter?
Yeah, I think one thing is that this isn't, it's not that we are not learning from our history, it's that the kind of particular makers of policy at this particular moment take very different lessons from it, I think. And one of those lessons is one in which people sort of should have the capacity to exert any kind of supremacy over the environment they live in that they want to, which includes things like hunting from the air, hunting predators in situations where it is not ecologically indicated at all. And, that has been a major strain in American history for a very long time, and is having kind of a resurgence. It's not that people don't understand what the repercussions of this are. I think it's that some people in power actually like the particular repercussions that these policies come with, and are not particularly interested in thinking about human beings as animals who should have some sort of limit on their behavior. I really do think it comes from kind of a supremacist position on all sorts of axes. And one of those is kind of a speciesist one where, if we have the power to do it, we just should, as if we don't also kind of inhabit an ecological space where we need to make decisions in concert with other kind of factors. So yeah, I'm not a fan of these policies. They are, however, not entirely surprising, just given the kind of long history of U.S. wildlife policy and the kind of ebbs and surges that it goes through in terms of how it thinks about the relationship between people and wildlife.
Great. I actually had a question. Well, I wanted to rephrase a question from earlier, kind of about how, I think I asked how people in the lower 48 should view indigenous people. But I wanted to reframe it with the human supremacy kind of factor in mind. And, in your epilogue, you note that there's two judgments that are common by Westerners of Beringia today. One is that they're blamed for not modernizing fast enough, and the other view is blaming them for living outside of the Western concept of harmony with nature. And I guess I'm just curious if it would be wrong for foreigners, to use your definition of the word foreigner in your book, to look at an indigenous way of life as a model to attempt to reconnect with nature. And what I'm kind of asking two questions. One is just about the human supremacy, and if people down here can somehow break away from that, if we're capable of breaking away from that. But then also kind of comparing it to a different way of life. Sorry, that was a long-winded question.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is possible to think your way outside of imagining people as supreme. And in some ways, I think that we're going to have to think our way out of that as an American society sooner rather than later, simply because the amount of change that we have caused in the environment is going to make it very clear that we can't control that change. And, we're going to be living in a world where our lack of supremacy is actually really quite evident and an everyday activity. And you can think about things like the California wildfires, right? That's a place where you can put some of the cause very much on the changes that have happened to California's climate because of global warming. And at the same time, they're obviously outside of human control in some really fundamental ways, and in ways that make it pretty difficult to imagine that an individual human is somehow supreme over this environment. So I think the onus is on us to figure out how to think about our own societies as sort of flexible enough that we can think our way to that place. I'm a little leery, obviously, of people, looking at cultures that are not their own and just trying to sort of take things from them that seem useful. I think it's a kind of an instrumental kind of thinking that has often been associated with colonialism, frankly. And it's not quite that easy, right? It's not that you can go read a book about being in the Arctic, and I say this as an author of a book about the Arctic, and imagine that work is done, right? The kind of work of thinking differently about your place in the world, it's going to have to be tied to actions. And those are going to have to come from within our own culture, because we're not, that's what we're responsible for changing. So yes, I think it's possible to gather inspiration. I think there are places, deeper within the roots of our own societies where there are also models for this, that, the idea of human supremacy is actually relatively recent in most societies, and it's often emerges with fossil fuels, which really give us that illusion, right? And are now kind of coming back to take that illusion away in a kind of ironic twist. This is kind of a long and rambling answer, but I think that it's actually some of the most exciting work that's in front of us, is figuring out how to retool a political world that has been set up to speak only to human needs, and see how we can actually meet those human needs, really kind of think about it in terms of justice for the people that exist now, but also think about having a more capacious idea of what kinds of beings need to be included in our politics, so that we can give some space to the whales and give some space to the environment kind of writ large in a way that hasn't happened fully in the past.
I just out of curiosity, is there anything that gives you personal hope that we're making progress to this disconnect, or rather reconnect with nature and our understanding of nature?
I think one of the things, so I find the question of what gives me hope, I've started to find it almost frustrating, because I think that in English, the way that we talk about hope is as something that's given to you rather than something that you make. And I think at this point, we really need to be making our hope, not imagining that someone's going to hand it to us, because there's a lot of work to be done. But I think that one of the places where I see people really trying to do that work is that there is a real, and I think quite recent, appetite amongst communities all across the U.S. for thinking about their relationships with the environment differently. It's a different kind of environmentalism. I'm not even sure it wears that label all the time. And in two ways that I find really striking, that people in a much more mainstream way are talking about environmental justice than even a couple of years ago, and certainly more than a decade ago. and that people are talking about and have a real interest in thinking about ways of imagining being in the world that are capable of pulling in, trees and animals and geological forms. And you can see this in the popularity of books like The Overstory, which, kind of out of nowhere becomes this runaway bestseller that everyone is talking about, because of the idea that trees are so critical to people. That's right at the center of that book. I think the fact that Robin Wall Kimmerer's book, Braiding Sweetgrass, made it onto the New York Times bestseller list after being, it's been published for several years, and then kind of emerges out of this chain of word of mouth and people just being so excited about the content of that book, is another place where you really see that there's a hunger for thinking this way, and that because it's obviously not localized, it's all over, that there's real opportunity in that, and there's people who really want to push that forward and make it a piece of how we imagine the future.
Well, for whatever it's worth, your answer about being frustrated by the question of hope was, it gave me hope.
Hope. Good.
I appreciated it.
Borrowed Time is a collaborative effort by librarians to combat climate change by discussing sustainability issues and all things related to the human influence on our ecosystem. For more episodes, visit borrowed-time.org.